Howdy, howdy. Welcome back to my tiny corner of the internet. And so, I was watching a video today by Joshua Fluke that I had woken up to pretty early in the morning to, and it was the idea that companies in the United States, because they see the aggressive rise of China, are now trying to implement what is known as the 996 work schedule into the United States. In fact, I saw one LinkedIn post in the video that was saying Chinese people are actually working 007, meaning that they have 0 days off and they work 7 days a week. It was actually one of the larpiest things. But what 996 means, it was an unhealthy piece of work culture in China in the 2000s during the British industrialization period of China. And it was the idea that you work from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. 6 days a week. Okay? And so the thing is that in the early Industrial Revolution, especially in the British Empire, people were working this long as well. This is a piece of historical fact that, once again, the ruling class doesn't want to let you know. Okay? And so the thing is in the early Industrial Revolution, which started in the British Empire, oftentimes people were working that long, if not longer. And so the idea that we work 996, that's just a feature of early industrialization. Now, the funny part is the American ruling class would like to pretend that this is what made China competitive. No, not really. It really isn't making it competitive. It's because the Chinese have long since banned 996 work culture since the early 2010s. And in fact, Jack Ma, a prominent billionaire within China, actually the reason he got knocked down a notch is because he started trying to promote 996 work culture in China at the end of the 2010s, and the CCP, the Communist Party, had to shut him down on that one. That's something that the mainstream American media, that the ruling class, loves to pretend still exists. It doesn't really exist in modern China anymore. And so a fun fact about communist ideology, and I'm going to say this as somebody who is more or less a communist as well, is that the whole point of automation and technology and advancing the forces of production is to increase free time and then increase human creativity. Okay? 996 work culture isn't something that is a part of China anymore. And it was something that was a natural facet of the Industrial Revolution, especially early industrialization. And if you remember that the Chinese didn't really industrialize until the 90s and the 2000s, and if you remember all the memes in the 2000s about China being an industrial shithole, yeah, that's because, that work culture is something that is a natural consequence of early industrialization. And it was no different in industrial Britain as well. Now, but here's once again how the idiotic nature of the American ruling class is once again kind of misunderstanding the facts to rewrite history to again serve a narrative, okay? And so they know that they're falling behind China. They can see the high-speed rails. They can see the advanced drone technology. They can see that, the standard of living and purchasing power parity in China is getting better in comparison to the United States. How does the American ruling class respond to this threat? Let's analyze that. Okay, so I said this before in several of my previous videos, that the American ruling class was going to go down the route that believing that the reason that the United States is falling behind is because if they just crack the whip on wages hard enough, they'll be able to make America competitive to China once again. And I said this was going to happen. Now it's happening. There are certain American CEOs that are now trying to bring back the 6-day work week instead of the 5-day work week. And the fun fact about the 5-day work week and why you have the weekend in the first place is because the various labor movements that existed by the end of the 19th century that fought and died for those weekends to have the 40-hour work week. And it got bloody. It got violent. People would blow up factories. You got to understand that, the thing is that people talk about workers' revolution as it's some kind of light thing, okay? But in the late 19th century and the early 20th century, it was incredibly common. The fact is that when people were working, from 6 a.m. in the morning to 9 p.m. at night in factories with no social life, no private life whatsoever, in the early Industrial Revolution, you begin to understand why the idea of workers' revolution was a very common thing in the first place. And, you'll understand why people did crazy things and why communism as an ideology became as prominent as it was in those times. And now, unironically enough, the American ruling class wants to take us back to those times. They want people back in the factories working from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. at night, 6 days a week. And if they had it their way, some of the LinkedIn posts I saw from Joshua Fluke's video is that they want us working 7 days a week, which traditionally in the early Industrial Revolution, that was the case. Everyone was desperately poor, barely earning enough money just to pay rent and pay for food. And they were working 7 days a week, 9 or 12 hours a day. That was what the early industrial period was like. That was until, again, workers' rights movements, labor rights movements, movements that actually went out of their way and did crazy shit to ensure that the working class actually had a decent standard of living. All these things, that have been forgotten in today. Notice how the ruling class is trying to bring this back. Now, in this case, it's mostly to try and compete against a false image with China. okay? The thing is, I've said this before. All the propaganda that they say about outside countries, eventually gets used and recycled to say, oh, well, we created this whole narrative about 996 and about how, it sucks so bad in China. And now that China's having some success, we have to do what the propaganda says about China to be competitive, like 996, even though 996 isn't even relevant. Okay. So yes, they will create an entire propagandized image of another country that isn't even true. And then the American ruling class say, see, this is what they're doing, so we need to do it too. And so they're not even doing anything that the propaganda is saying that they're doing. They just want to do it here for any other reason to what they think is going to make them competitive. That's what it comes down to it. And so the thing is that you're noticing, I've said this before, this is exactly what the ruling class was going to do. And I told you this was going to do is because the fact is now they're getting upset because they feel like they're falling behind. And so now they're looking at the propaganda of what they have of China and say, okay, well, we need to do the exact same thing here. Even though quite literally, that is not true. That is not what made American competitive. And if you want to look at like the standard of living in the 1950s, where people had work-life balance, and this was all because of strong unionization efforts, strong workers' rights movement, strong American labor, and a 90% corporate tax rate, this is what gave rise to the middle-class lifestyle, not what the American ruling class is saying, okay? Because at the end of the day, human ingenuity doesn't come from grinding 12 hours a day, 7 days a week. We have very little free time in a factory, okay? That's not where ingenuity or creativity comes from. It comes from free time. When you have nothing better to do and you come up with new ideas, that's where creativity comes from. And so the idea that the 996 work schedule is going to make American competitive, no. We live in the technological age. We don't live in brute industrialization anymore where factory production is a prominent thing. Most of that stuff is done by robots. If you want to be competitive against another country, that requires free time. But notice how the American ruling class will never say that America needs to be competitive in terms of house prices or rent prices. In fact, I'm going to pull up a guy that I follow on Twitter, and he talked about how, there's a rental unit that actually is quite nice in China that runs equivalently in US dollars for $300 a month. I want you to go anywhere in the United States and find a single, actually, not even a decent one, just a single apartment or a place that you can rent that's over 500 square feet for $300 a month. And I promise you, you will not find a single Zillow listing. If you want to prove me wrong, it's probably in some podunk town where there's no jobs in the first place, but, feel free, okay? But notice how the American ruling class never says that they want America to be competitive in terms of prices for labor, like house prices, groceries, or anything else. It's not about competitive being in terms of healthcare. It's not about being competitive in terms of groceries. It's not about being competitive in terms of house prices or, the cost of living. It's about, how can we grind the wagey hard enough to be fictitiously competitive to this other country? Which is ironic. Because once again, you would think that they would, I'm not even asking the ruling class to do this. If they actually want to be competitive, they have to address the cost of living crisis. They have to make things, competitive in that terms, is because I want to give you a little bit of story. This is how the ruling class tries to have its cake and eat it too. Okay, everyone loved to talk about feminists 10 to 15 years doing that back then. Okay, I'm going to tell you the ruling class loves to have their cake and eat it too. They want to have it both ways. Okay, they want to have a high cost living is because that's where they make most of their profits from. But at the same time, they don't like the idea of having to payroll employees to foot this cost of living, is because this is a non-negotiable. Okay. People always need a place to live, and they will always need food. That is the bare minimum of subsistence that even Marx talked about, okay? And you need that just to exist. And so this is a non-negotiable. If you want to make that cost high, that's going to make the cost of labor higher, because that's just the necessary part to reproduce a day's worth of labor. That's just a fact of reality. And this is, again, how the ruling class likes to have their cake and eat it too. They like the profits that they get from exploiting the shit and rent seeking from wages when they have to pay high cost of living for housing, groceries, and health, right? They love making money off of that, but then they don't like the idea that they have to pay employees to actually cover that cost, because that's a baseline operational cost for every worker. And they get really upset about it. They want to have their cake and eat it too. So here's kind of the thing. I never see the ruling class say they want to be competitive in making these things cheaper, is because it directly contributes to the baseline operational cost of every worker in this country, but they'll never talk about that, because once again, they're trying to offset and pass the cost to the American worker to try and be competitive to China. They're not going to give up their seventh yacht to do this. They're not going to do it to make the standard of living a little bit better. And this is not even to say like, oh, this is unfair. This is just a baseline operational cost to operate a worker in the United States that they can't get around. Everybody needs a place to live, and they need to be able to feed themselves. That's just a baseline operational cost that you can't get around. And so you can either make these things cheaper and people will work for lower wages and be more competitive, or you keep them high and get upset that you have to pay American workers more and then complain about how you're going to hire H-1B visas or basically trying to get immigrant labor to do it, which, honestly, that's a baseline worker cost for them too. So I don't know why you're trying to do that. That's kind of an entire mythology. But, that's the interesting thing. Okay, in Montana, over the course of COVID, I want to tell you a story. There's a video. I might link the documentary in the channel description, or the video description. But, a bunch of rich people moved to Montana because it's a very beautiful state. Me and my wife want to visit at least once in our lifetimes. But when we were looking to, visit there and maybe even move there, there were a lot of, we noticed that there was a huge migration of rich people there too. And what happened was when the rich people moved there, they drove the cost of housing significantly higher, because they go, it's rich people. They go in like fucking locusts and they buy everything and they buy up all these properties, driving up the asset prices. Well, the consequential effect was that they drove up house prices so much that the locals can't even afford to rent in the place that they originally lived in, because rich people, like the locusts they are, go in the area, drive up house prices, make everything expensive. Okay, and you know what the rich people had the audacity to bitch and complain about? Did they bitch and complain about how they drove up house prices and everyone's basically being pushed out of their hometowns is because rich people acted like locusts again? No, they bitched and complained is because, they drove up house prices so much that nobody could afford to work minimum wage jobs so they could enjoy the fast food services and conveniences they like around them. That is how retarded rich people are, okay? This is why I don't listen to right-wing conspiracies about how they're like a cartel of lizards and, they're demons and then they eat people and they're interdimensional or some shit, because, you make it seem like they're far more intelligent than they actually are, okay? Rather than just a bunch of self-serving retards. That's all the ruling class is. They're just self-serving idiots. And so, they can't even think past the first or second quarter of any year's profits to think of any larger implications of or consequences of their actions. When they go into Montana to buy up all these properties and drive up house prices, all they're thinking about is their asset prices going up. And then they bitch and complain that because housing is so unaffordable, they can't even stage minimum wage workers to, do fast food service work for them. That's how retarded they are. They don't think of anything logistically. They're just like, oh, asset prices go up, so it must be good for me, bro. Why is there no minimum wage workers? Why can't they work the McDonald's in my immediate vicinity? It's not that I drove up house prices or anything. They don't think of that. Okay? And so when I see these stupid little ads, like I said in the last video, when the BlackRock CEO is saying actually, housing has never really been a thing that, the vast majority of Americans enjoyed. It was only for rich people, right? They're not thinking about housing costs in terms of the baseline operational costs for workers, right? They really don't care. They just automatically think synonymously that their existence is good. And so if asset prices go up, everything must be good. They don't think of any term in any terms of logistical efficiency beyond that. Okay? And that's why I said, the United States is not going to successfully compete against China, because asking these very same rich people oh, why don't you prop down a high-speed rail between every major urban center in this country? Or you prop up high voltage, direct current lines across the nation to make a unified electrical grid. Or you ask them to prop down 500 nuclear fission power plants to make electricity significantly cheaper. Their rent-seeking ass would be so offended that you even suggested the idea of making things cheaper that they would just say, they would just ignore it. Okay, and the reason I know this is because I have talked to these people. I have reasoned with these people. These people are unreasonable. Okay, that's why I don't go out of my way engaging in debate as much as I used to, is because the fact is I've spent my time trying to reason with people. And the thing is, again, I'll say it like I did in the last video, you can take a horse to the river, but you can't make it drink. Okay, and that's just a fundamental, facet of life. You can talk to people all you want, and you can try and change their mind, but if they've made up their mind like the American ruling class has about the 996 work schedule, there's no reasoning with them. And that's why I don't particularly blame people who just leave the country. I've seen several people in my comment section talk about, I'm just going to leave the country. And the fun fact is that, I'm going to give some, indicators. You want to go to a good country that actually thinks logically and efficiency, feel free to take advantage of China's key visa system, where if you're a young engineer who's been screwed over by your own country, that's been underpaid in your own country, why don't you give them a shot? The only thing I'm going to say is that if you go to another person's country, try to be respectful of their customs, laws, and traditions, and recognize that you're a guest in somebody else's house. That's all I'm going to say, right? Because you don't want to be an asshole. You want to respect other people's culture if you're a guest in their house. So, That's just some food for thought. I'm probably going to stay here, but if they get too fucking annoying, I might bounce out with me and my wife too, because I'm not going to deal with this shit. These people are retarded. So I don't blame anybody who leaves the United States. I know that sounds depressing as hell, but you know, it's not a shocker to me. Everything I have said on this channel about Donald Trump's administration, the American ruling class, is largely coming to fruition. I'm not surprised by any of it. It's just kind of going almost exactly, you know, as I expected it would be. You know, par and T, since I made my first videos talking about the Trump administration back in February. You know, so none of this stuff is surprising to me. In fact, I actually, in the next video, I'm going to be talking about AI pricing, another rent-seeking attitude that they want to do here in the United States that I just finished talking to my wife about, and I'm just kind of surprised. We're really going to invent a new technology to see how much money you can squeeze out, not whether or not we can build a really cool technology. That never comes out of their fucking mouths. Okay, it's not, oh, let's build this really cool project and see how it turns out. That never comes out of their mouths, okay, of the American ruling class. It's like, how can we rent seek even more and take even more profit that is literally just an exchange of money that produces no actual tangible, like, real value to civilization? They'll talk about that all day, but they'll talk about house prices and how they screwed over younger generations and how young people need to pay into Social Security, but they won't talk about building actual value that makes civilization good or even efficient. Okay, this is what the American ruling class is doing with 996 culture. It's just, once again, another way for the ruling class to pass operational costs to the worker once again. But this time it won't work, just like it didn't work in Montana when rich people went there. I'm sorry, but the thing is, there's a such thing as baseline subsistence, and you just can't go any lower. And that contributes to the falling rate of profit too. And so if you want to continue doing that, and you know, you're going to realize that you're essentially pulling your own chain, you're pulling your own rope. You got nothing left to take, bro. You have to actually make something. You have to actually create value. You can't just, you know, shuffle money around and expect, you know, something to change. That's just not how that works. So with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and close off the video because I think I made my point. This was a ranty video because I saw this video by Joshua Fluke, and I just kind of, you know, every time everyone talks about like fatigue, I'm going to talk about Porky fatigue, okay? You know what? Every time I hear something like this, it's just like I roll my eyes so far back in my skull. It's like I almost want to I'm going to cut that out, but unalive myself. But, you know, you just kind of realize, yeah, this is so ridiculous. There's no hope for this country. Let's just bounce. Peace.